Welcome to Cliburn Masterpiece. I'm Buddy Bray. I'm your host for Masterpiece, and we come to you from the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. In Cliburn Masterpiece, we look at some of the greatest works ever written for the solo piano. We talk to some pianists who are a part of our Cliburn family, and we talk to other experts in the field of music as well. On this episode of Cliburn Masterpiece, a piano work that's full of charm but also full of pianistic hurdles, we'll be talking about both books of the variations on the theme by Paganini by Johannes Brahms. We'll talk to Alexander Kobrin, who is the 2005 gold medalist of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition. We'll also talk to Canadian violinist and pianist James Ehnes about Paganini and why composers seem to be so drawn to the Paganini legend. Here's our conversation with Alex and James. James, what is it that is so attractive or scary or any of that about Paganini for violinists?
Well, I think those are two different questions, somewhat related, but somewhat not. Paganini is just such an incredible figure in musical history, and then certainly his importance to the violin. I think you can't overstate it. But really, I'm glad to have the chance to talk about Paganini, not strictly within the context of the violin, because of course what he did in terms of furthering the instrument was really incredible and kind of unparalleled. But I think sometimes we lose sight of his importance in the musical world in general. He was an incredible influence to, there are wonderful anecdotes, told by Rossini, Schubert, of course, we're going to be talking about Brahms, all of these composers that were influenced not just by his legacy, but by his music itself. He was an incredibly gifted lyrical composer. Like, I think so much time is spent talking about the technical difficulties of what he wrote that we sometimes forget that in much of his music, the real beauty is this incredible singing Italian style that he was. I really think in a way he was Rossini for the violin.
Can we talk about these 24 caprices of Paganini, just in a general sense? When do those enter the life of a violinist, and do they stay in a violinist's life forever once they enter?
Well, to answer the second question first, I think they should. I think that they occupy a tremendously important role, not just in the literature, but also in the upkeep of a violinist's game. As far as when they enter, I think for many kind of aspiring professional violinists, it's at a reasonably young age that you at least become aware of them, and then you start making your attempts at some of the slightly more accommodating ones. But I don't know, for me, I got kind of fascinated with those pieces pretty early. In my little hometown in Brandon, Manitoba, Canada, I don't remember exactly why, but I think from my Suzuki class or something, maybe I was selected to be on this local television show about, I don't really know what. Maybe I played a little something. Maybe it was about music education. I don't know. But in any case, the woman that set it up, who was kind of head of the Suzuki program in my town, she, as a little gift for doing this, she gave me a record, an LP of Itzhak Perlman playing the 24 Caprices, because I guess on the show they interviewed me and they said, "What kind of music do you like?" And I said, "I like fast music." So and I have this record and it's signed to me and it says, "I hope this is fast enough for you." So, that was sort of how I was introduced to those pieces. And yeah, it was kind of in my teens, I guess, that I started working through them, and just one led to the next, as I just felt like being able to sort of work through any one of them, I felt I learned so much from it.
let's talk for a minute about why you think that Liszt, Brahms, Schumann, Rachmaninoff, and others might have been so charmed by Paganini that they went off on their own flights of fancy. What do you think is so attractive for somebody who's going to write piano music? Why is the specter of Paganini so attractive?
Well, I'll say something that's probably a little controversial within our industry. I think frankly that all of these great masters that you just mentioned, they were all trying to capture something, and they do, but I don't know that any of them in any of that music captured it quite as successfully as Paganini himself. In that, for me, the amazing thing, and this is in a way it's tied into a difference between the violin and the piano, but on the violin, the pieces are immensely difficult and immensely complicated while also having a simplicity to them that once you get them onto the piano and people are, like the Liszt ones are quite a good example to me, where it's like, it just becomes, there's just so much.
The theme is obviously became very famous with violinists. And for them, it represents ultimate virtuosity. Even though when I hear it on the violin, I'm like, it's kind of slow. Uh, yeah, pianists used to play it so much faster. And I think we brought, thanks to all these people that you mentioned, we brought this music into a new dimension. Um, and so I don't know, it's really exciting. I think it's an easy theme to develop.
I think there is something to that. I think that when you have a simple theme that is sort of uncomplicated, that gives you the same rhythm over the same sort of melodic contour, it's an easy theme to get in your ear, and therefore an easy theme to write variations on.
Like the 24th Caprice, for example, the thing that is, I think the real reason why that one has remained one of the great earworms of history and has been so appealing and has just rooted itself into so many other composers is that Paganini takes something that is so incredibly simple, and in a way that is kind of unusual for him. I mean, he as a melodist, and we talked about what wonderful melodist he was, often there was this real kind of heart on sleeve bel canto, but in the 24th Caprice, that theme is very spare and it's very austere in a certain sense. And then it develops and it develops and it develops and it develops. And the piece is, I mean, it's not just a virtuoso piece, but it's a virtuoso piece of composition, if that makes sense. The pacing of it, the architecture of that piece, the way that it leads up to the finale, the proportions, the length, it all just works. And I think that these great composers throughout history have just been fascinated.
Can you tell us what you remember about playing the Brahms Paganini in the competition?
It was, look, it was 16 years ago, so I hardly remember anything. No, I'm just kidding. And Paganini variations were one of those pieces where it's kind of, you sort of gamble because obviously when you put something like this on the program and there's the expectation is very high. But for me, I remember I never put this piece in the program for the sake of kind of show off. But of course, obviously, it's a virtuosic piece, and that there is some strategy behind it, of course, especially when you think about the composition. But ultimately, I think for me, these variations were always the very natural combination of virtuosic music in the sense, the most musical sense of this word. And it was very, you know, challenging emotionally, and consider all the pressure all contestants had. I don't remember anything particular being stressed about this piece outside of any other repertoire, because the repertoire, as you remember, it was absolutely vast, and but that was quite fun to play.
Is it a piece that you learned when you were a student? Can you tell us a little bit about your process in learning, about how long you took to learn it before you ventured to play it in public?
I started with the first book, of course. I started at the end of my last year in high school, and then going to the conservatory. And first, I stayed with book one, because that was enough. It felt so nice because it's not too long. It fits in different combinations of the program. So for Busoni, I learned the second book, and that was a rather revelation, because when you practicing them separately, it seems like it's a different piece. And then when you work on them together, you realize that the main challenge is how do you actually continue through this half an hour of, let's face it, sort of similar ideas, yeah? At least in the first book, and then you go into the second book, which to me has much lighter flavor. There's a lots of dolce there, even in the most sophisticated, most technical, challenging virtuosic variations, which are mostly soft, mostly light. And you think of Brahms, a heavyweight champion, yeah, and that's how this set begins. First two variations is like first two Chopin etudes, the worst nightmare. If you go through them, then the rest is all right. But the second book brings you to a completely different world.
Have you always played them both together in concert?
Once I've started playing them together, then I maintain playing them together. I sort of stopped seeing both books separately, because the reason for me to start with the first book was just this simple convenience. It was just too much to learn both, and I wasn't that courageous. Yeah, and then I learned both books, and I kept playing them. It just came naturally as a cycle for me, as a combination of both two very opposites in many ways, and I think I don't know, it gets more serious in this way.
The Brahms variations, often when composers have taken Paganini's theme, the first part of the theme is repeated, and then sometimes they will repeat the second half of the theme as well. And Paganini did not do that. And there's something, I'm not criticizing Brahms's treatment of it, because that became a very different piece, a very different ideal. But there's something in that theme that it is both complete and self-contained, but also leaving you kind of wanting a little more. It's like that's it. And that, I think, is why it leads from variation to variation. It never wears out its welcome, and in some of the variations in the Tony Parker pieces, like there will be something quite spectacular that happens in the second half of the phrase that's not repeated, and that's on purpose. It's like, no, you don't get to see that again, because that's the way things live in our memory. You're like, what just happened? And like, if you saw it happen twice, it would lose the magic. I think it's just so well put together.
In the Brahms Paganini, again, one has to tell the story from beginning to end, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. How do you practice telling the story? And can you practice it? Or do you need an audience to tell the story to?
Oh, okay. So now you're touching so many important things. Let's go with how do you practice this story? You don't practice this story. You either have the story or you don't. And if you don't, you're in trouble. And now there are different ways to obtain this story. You have to read what they were reading. And every art influences one another. Brahms' music been influenced by music and by literature, by German Romantic literature, as Schumann's as well, and um, and Beethoven's and so forth. So I think the question of the story is, we're not composing this music. We did not write it. We cannot possibly get into Brahms' mind, even though we should, as much as possible. And so, of course, we have to understand what they had in mind writing certain music, what happened. And as often there is some sort of a tragic incident or some refusal, and this is very easy for us to relate to. But sometimes you read about their life, you read letters, and there is nothing. And then there is this absolute tragedy, Greek tragedies unfolding in front of you. And you trying to understand, where is that coming from? And so, getting to under that, I think the solution is just to submerge yourself into Brahms or the composer's life, and um, understanding his psychology. I'm not the fan of reading letters. I just feel like I'm invading some personal space, but at the same time, letters give you so many answers. So that's probably another way. And then we stepping on the question of, okay, so where are we coming in here? And that's where the 40s coming to the answer. Through our life, we have different stories. We have different life experiences. In 20s it's a one life experience. In your 20s, everything is bad. It's terrible. It's a disaster. And then in 30s, it's like you're a little bit tired. And in the 40s, you're looking back and you realize, oh, well, I think that's it. And then the last half has started, and who knows, and then, you see a doctor tomorrow. And so your story changes. And I think the natural integration of these two stories are emerging on stage. And it doesn't have to be the same story every time. I think we also have to be very flexible with the momentum, yeah, with spontaneity of the interpretation.
Now, getting back to more sort of violinistic things, though, I mean, he really, it's amazing how he didn't come out of nowhere. There was a legacy of virtuosic violin playing, particularly in his native Italy, but one gets a sense from playing his music that he had very particular and kind of peculiar hands, the way that they worked and the things they were able to accomplish. He was well known for having, there's actually a name for it. I can't remember what it is.
It's Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or something. Is that it?
Yeah, where he had this incredible flexibility and his fingers just kind of went everywhere. You can tell when you're playing that music that much violin music, even the really highly virtuosic stuff, is somewhat anchored in hand position, whereas Paganini's everything is kind of going this way and that way and the other. So it's a particular left hand technique. The challenges of left hand, right arm, it's all quite special and had lasting influence, but also in a way has remained unique, even though what he did to the advancing of the violin technique was permanent. No one has ever been quite like him, and I think he's a tremendously valuable composer for violinists to study, because in a way, like if you can play the Paganini 24 Caprices, there's really nothing that you're not going to be able to do. It pretty much is an encyclopedia of things that are hard. Another thing that's interesting to remember about Paganini's Caprices, this idea of how could he do this? How could he do this? It's the only piece that he published during his lifetime, and as far as whether he really played these pieces or not, it's kind of hard to say. Like it was, I believe, dedicated, I think, to the artists was the dedication in Italian. And I think that there was part of it that it was the only piece he published because it was the piece that he felt most confident that no one else was going to be able to play. I mean, he knew the difficulty of what he was writing. Like I feel also pretty comfortable as a violinist who's played a lot, most of his music, that to play the Paganini caprices properly is considerably more difficult than anything else he wrote. You know, everything else he wrote had these elements of it, but to be able to play all those caprices properly is kind of on a different level.
When everybody thinks of Brahms Paganini variations, the first thing you think of, oh my God, it's so difficult. But actually, the main goal is to create this world of virtuosity and Brahms' passion and character through those virtuosic problems you might face. You know, something similar you work on Chopin etudes, and of course, and I think that's the key for me. Always been how to learn the piece through musical goals, through understanding what kind of uh, flavor, character, feeling each variation has, and somehow fingers follow.
So, what is the difference between, for you anyway, between the way that Brahms wrote for the piano in a virtuosic way and the way that somebody like Liszt wrote for the piano in a virtuosic way?
You know, Brahms was blamed often for being very sloppy pianist because he never practiced. And I think that was the reason why he stopped really playing. Especially if you look at his schedule, there are records of his touring schedule, and including meals, meetings, receptions, and all this stuff. And you really realize there is no time schedule for practicing. And there's this recital in the evening, and or duet with the violinist, and so forth. So this is very different from Liszt approach to piano. Brahms' writing in general, for me, has always been related to the symphony and chamber music. And chamber music goes into play in his later piano works, and symphony gets into, uh, first three sonatas. You know, it's all three big symphonies. And then, obviously, I think you could also call these variations symphonic variations in this sense, in the sense of texture, in the sense of sound and texture and drive and energy and rhythm, of course. Conducting pulse is very obvious there.
What I hear you saying is that Brahms was after bigger ideas than just the piano. His ideas about music could not be necessarily contained by the piano and by piano writing sometimes.
So I think so, especially considering his desperation for the symphonic work. It's like Beethoven was desperate about opera and the mess or something vocal, yeah. That Brahms, I think, was very desperate for the symphony, and I think I don't know other composer who would write such big symphonic works right away. You know, first few opuses is already out of five, three, this humongous works, and especially the third sonata, sort of a statement of something grand.
Do you think that an audience likes to see the struggle a little bit? Do they want to know it's difficult?
You know, I think it's a little bit of both. There's in virtuoso repertoire in particular, there is theater in that. There's theater that's written into the music, and you know, I mean, here we are talking for the Cliburn, you know, and I get thinking about pianists, you know, and I think about uh, one of the supreme virtuosos, you know, Horowitz, and you think about some of the things that he would do, you'd see it, you're like, I don't know how that guy is doing that. And sometimes it was like this eruption of a volcano, and there was drama in that. And other times it was like he was tossing it off in the most, with the greatest of ease. And people were, and including myself, were also like, well, I don't know how he does that either. So, you know, I think there's a time and a place for both, you know, where part of the virtuosity is in the struggle almost. And there's also times where part of the virtuosity is in, you know, honestly, it's a little bit of one of those things where it's like, well, this is easy for me. even if it's not, because of course it never is, but there is something fun of seeing that. It's sort of like, oh yeah, I can just, roll out of bed and do this, no problem.
I think people were excited about virtuosity. Look at Beethoven. I mean, his sonatas had the purpose of being virtuosic to show off. That like he never really he was never ashamed of this. He was actually saying that that's what's the purpose. And then Liszt, of course, Liszt and everybody else after him. I think the question is if there is only if that's the only thing that public wants. And I think the idea of music being an entertainment, which again is not new at all. Haydn, Mozart, and everybody else, were servants to entertain aristocracy and the ordinary public. But I think then that's why I think in 19th century the music became such important art, where it was no longer an entertainment, but more of an enlightenment, more of education, more of a guide to the truth, the guide to the most sophisticated parts of our soul to answer so many emotional, psychological questions. And I think music like Brahms Paganini variations could also be a representation of both. Someone could just see the piece and perform the piece from the standpoint of entertainment, just to show off the fire, the steam coming out of fingertips. Yeah. Or you present it as Brahms had this idea of Paganini as the sort of legendary, mythical, enigmatic, demonic, whatever, true romantic. Yeah, no wonder Schumann put Paganini as one of his Davidsbündler characters for the carnival, part of his sect. So this is the question of, again, spirit. In a way, Brahms Paganini is spiritual music as well. And I think when we talk about virtuosity, I think if you listen to Gillis, that's the best example of how virtuosity serves the music. And that's what I was trying always to do.
Maybe then the Brahms Paganini variations were a perfect piece for you in 2005. I think, in summing up, because there is so much content which is not about piano virtuosity in them. There are certain variations which are very difficult to bring off on the piano, but they are really not about display. They are not really about that.
I have to agree with you. I think we clicked throughout my artistic life.
From the preliminary round of the 2005 edition of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition, here is gold medalist Alexander Kobrin in the Variations on a Theme by Paganini, both books of them, by Johannes Brahms. That's it for this episode of Cliburn Masterpiece. Our thanks to our 2005 gold medalist, Alexander Kobrin. Also, our thanks to Canadian violinist James Ehnes for helping us figure out what is so alluring about the works of Niccolò Paganini. Our thanks, as always, to the Kimball Art Museum for hosting us, and thank you for watching. I'm Buddy Bray for the Cliburn.